So, for those not familiar with me, this is mostly coming from a Web3 background. So, by Web3, what we're meaning is blockchain, crypto, how open source is handled. It's a evolution of, we use the word Web2, Web3 quite interchangeably, and Web2 is basically where you could read and write on the internet. Web3 is where you can own it. Anything you put out there, you own the data, decentralization, transparency. Also, degen culture, other not so pro side as you get NFTs, meme coins, and stuff like that. But there actually is more utilization behind blockchain and stuff like that. And open source sustainability has kind of been the big topic over the last year, with Germany taking it serious with the Sovereign Tech Agency, GitHub doing the Open Source Secure Fund, and the biggest accomplishment, the Open Source Endowment Fund, which got a charity status in the US, getting the IRS to acknowledge that open source is critical, and then seeing the work that CMS does. It's very encouraging for the future of open source, as long as we can get on the AI situation with them potentially taking over open source contributions. But with Web3 and especially blockchain ecosystems, the transition for how you do open source infrastructure is actually a bigger escalating issue, and a traditional OSPO model doesn't really accomplish that, and that's why we have this decentralized OSPO. And what we mean by that is it's an open source program office that isn't under a corporate umbrella, but is owned by a community governance layer where it is decentralized. Its mandate and its operations are set by the entity or government bodies of that ecosystem to fulfill an executive mandate. I think they set the foundation for what an open source program office does, and they're a perfect reference point for a lot of things, but I didn't know which composition the audience was going to be. So when we're talking about open source, every project has fundamentals. They have licensing needs, governance, contribution, maintenance, and the big one is sustainability. And sustainability is the theme. How do you fund projects? And I deep dived into this specifically because with blockchain ecosystems, they have native tokens and their own monetary and financial systems. So they can actually self-sustain the infrastructure that they build on, depending on how they address that and correlate the problems. And we did a lot of interesting studying on the different programs I mentioned earlier in the Web2 space and how to handle these issues. Because when you start introducing money into projects, it actually changes the dynamic of an open source project indirectly. So the things that I'll focus on, everyone is familiar with Web2 and traditional open source, thanks to the CMS deck. But in Web3 and blockchain ecosystems, software is not just general infrastructure. It is the product that everything is built on. There is a native protocol that subsets how everything's done, and just so common reference point, every transaction and everything that is done is put on a public ledger that is immutable. Anything that goes on that cannot be changed, and that's where you get this security behind things. Governance is also on chain, so the best way to compare this is like the US government's my common reference point, where we have the protocol and the financial system, which would be the US Treasury equivalent, and then you have a governance layer. And Cardano being my coming point, where I was the senior manager for the governance piece, they have a liquid democracy model where they actually have a judicial, legislative, and executive branch. And if you hold ADA, which is equivalent to the US dollar, it means you're a citizen of that digital nation. And it's one ADA, one vote. And you actually compile however much ADA, which is in your digital wallet, to a designated representative, we call a DREP, and they vote on your behalf. But we have what we call epochs, which is when the ledger state updates due to on-chain activity. And within that epoch period, if you don't like the way a certain DREP voted, you can actually change your delegation to someone else. So you're not stuck with the same politician perspective per se. And that's our legislative branch, because they also do determine proposals and stuff. We have an executive branch, which is comprised of entities, and actually, no, the executive branch is the DREPs. The entities, the vendors, and the general token holders they're validators and operators of the network. They have their own voting related to protocol level changes and can propose things like funding from their public treasury, which Cardano has $1.6 billion of tax fees that have accumulated over transactions that is spent on different things. So it's government spending towards public infrastructure, and that's where I'm coming in saying open source is public infrastructure, and that's why Web3 just made it undeniable that everyone builds on this protocol. And then our we have a constitution that 20,000 people came together within Cardano that published that, and that's the government undeniable principles that everyone must follow. And there's a constitutional committee that people run on, and they also vote to make sure any actions done are constitutional. So that's brief context for getting caught up on the Web3 example for this. That's me. I can probably skip this too, because all I'm trying to say here is Web3 isn't just software, it's a governing nation. And when you're talking about open source coordination and public infrastructure of that nation, there needs to be a way for a coordination agency to ensure things get done. And what I'm calling an OMF, which is an open maintenance framework for how we can build a portable architecture that can be translated to each ecosystem, and all of these programs be adaptable to their different needs. Because we have, I think there's 20,000 or more different blockchains, only probably the top 100 really relevant in practice, but each of them have their own dynamics, how decentralized they want to be, how transparent they want to be, if they're a permissioned environment versus permissionless. There's a lot of variables. And so with this context, I wanted to set in how a OSPO, trying to translate that for what my task was when I joined Cardano. How do you set up an OSPO-like function for such a big ecosystem need? And that's where we came into the problems of the different actors you have to manage. So you have the shared open source infrastructure, which is your protocol client, SDK, libraries, and tooling. And then you have different actors in the ecosystem. Consensus is done by people running nodes, and they validate transactions and activity. And my example was we had 3,000 of them. You also have the independent developers building their own projects and stuff, or decentralized apps is what we call it, dApps, on top of the protocol. You had community governance things, i.e. they wanted to make a decentralized autonomous organization where they essentially pull all money together and then do decentralized votes. And the outcome of whatever that vote is where the money gets allocated. And then you have commercial entities, which are enterprises trying to adopt on this. Hedera is a great example with the LFDT and their governing council of different institutions working that blockchain. And then you have foundations, and the protocol engineering organizations. These two are fundamental pretty much across all blockchains. You'll have a foundation to steward it, usually in Switzerland, and then engineering developing org that is actually responsible for the core code-based development. So, and the thing that's at center is they have a native token that shapes the interest, funds treasuries, and enables governance participation. So, what does a DOSPO add on top of the OSPO layer? You have on-chain governance authority. You have to be aware of treasury-funded programs. You should, in your design of the DOSPO, architect it to where it can be replaced with a new mandate or a new body. Fluidity and liquidity is a very big theme in Web3, and it depends on the ecosystems and how they want to address it. That thing is to escape a central actor having control of the network, typically. And there's ecosystem-wide accountability to factor into this. So that's what birthed the concept of the DOSPO. And there's 3 different things on the governance triangle within a Web3 ecosystem you have to be aware of. And legitimacy at the very top is basically, I'm defining it as where authority comes from and whether it's trusted. Execution is how fast you can act in a time-bound situation. And neutrality is avoiding of central actor capture risk. DAOs, as I mentioned earlier, they're very much legitimate because no one owns them and very neutral, but they have low execution because there's no coordination effort to deliver on things. Corporate OSPOs are legitimate and very high in execution, kind of low on the neutrality piece because it's a centralized company that runs it. Foundations are very strong on execution but have a neutrality risk as well. And that's where the DOSPO comes in because it kind of balances all 3 of these factors. So the open maintenance framework, which is the other piece to this, is actually just an operational system for showing how if you were to incorporate it into your ecosystem, how you can programs that other ecosystems do, pilots behind those, funding flows, and then lifecycle mechanics that translate into governance decisions on how you're sustaining your open source stewardship. And that comes from sustaining the people, growing the community, and sustaining infrastructure and the tooling stewardship. And it also builds on top of what the CMS was talking about when you have the maturity frameworks, how you manage the project day to day, and basic incubation and life cycle stuff. This is just another layer on top of it where we're actually trying to put a bang for buck when it comes to taxpayer funds coming to projects. And that's where the DOSPO and the OMF are two halves of the same system. So the DOSPO is the who coordinates because it fulfills the blockchain principles. The OMF is how does it run. This could be translated to Web 2 too, depending on where your revenue source is coming from. But the DOSPO is, because it's a government system, it's given an executive mandate where it doesn't control or own any of the projects. That's where it's different from a foundation where they're not directly incubated under this actor, but all the projects that participate in their funding programs are the incentivization factor. If you're part of it, you have to follow their policy and governance mandates. And that's where you can get into the life cycle maturity thing. And the program of the OMF where all these are done is actually, it's supposed to not just be project GitHub health metrics, but also ecosystem impact and systematic risk, making sure you're, for lack of a better word, ensuring your critical path is sustained, not just the core protocol, but alt node languages, developer, and stuff like that. It's very much a municipal government program where you have keep the lights on, municipal programs, and then net new bridges and enhancements to the overall ecosystem. So that's what these two have been designed for, to complement each other. And this is where it comes into. So you have a community governance layer, which is your token holders, delegates, and constitutional processes that set the mandate. And a DOSPO can be one of three domains. Typically, it's on the open source domain because that's where it comes from, and that's the most neglected piece. Because a lot of ecosystems just leave code on GitHub and say it's open source. It needs to be more than that. You have a technical domain of how things are done, standards, etc. Usually that's done by an improvement process that Ethereum helped pioneer with Bitcoin. And then a security domain, which how do you handle incident authority? How do you manage basically getting 3,000 node operators to upgrade an instance because a vulnerability was found? And the DOSPO area kind of coordinates depending on how these bodies dictate what the operator's supposed to do. So in Cardano, we had an open source committee, a technical steering committee, and a security council that the open source office under Intersect, which was our member-based org, did. And that's where I built a proto-DOSPO model into that. But it didn't fulfill that governance triangle, which is why I'm trying to export the concept into a community-owned function, and that's its exact executive mandate. It's bounded authority, it's a time-limited mandate, and it's replaceable by design depending on the impact. And then that connects to your ecosystem projects, maintainers, and infrastructure. In the enforcement mechanisms, there's some high ideas there for people that participate. How do you keep projects and people accountable to best open source practice? And then the renewal cycle is a DOSPO is funded by treasury funds, and it only justifies its existence to get refunded. So it has to deliver and coordinate the stuff for the community to vote to refund it and renew its charter. If it fails that mandate, there is a sunset mechanism where the community can shut it down and reset stuff. And this prevents institutions from justifying their existence without having actual impact. So this is my biggest thing that I am trying to fight with Web3 ecosystems is when you're talking about funding open source work, the instrument needs to match the project maturity, and not everything should be functioned as delivery-oriented funding. I've seen a lot of open source grants go to projects where they have to have milestone-based work, and it's like, how do you capture open source maintenance under that kind of framework? It needs to be classified as continuity-oriented funding, which is more about the activities a maintainer does on a regular basis, and ensuring that they have capacity to be available should something arise. And I think that's a big thing that I'm trying to evangelize. And that's where a maintainer retainer is a big one that we've pioneered with Cardano, where it's a part-time pay to keep maintainers around, but it also has a caveat that it introduces community people who haven't had a chance to work in the core protocol to be onboarded and be mentored under that framework, compensating both parties. That way you keep the tribal knowledge available, but are bringing in new talent, so you don't end up with lifetime Linux kernel maintainers. But there actually is a way to do that. And we tie it in with what funding mechanism kind of hits the maturity level, where delivery oriented works for a lot of like labs and projects that are just starting, bounties, scope contracts. Continuity is when you have a mature project and it's more about keeping it running versus there's a new feature that needs to be added, and maintenance. And then ecosystem wide is where it needs to be holistic things like the core protocol or SDKs. Everyone benefits on it, and it's a critical path. It's not just the ad hoc project. And then there's some funding principles here on how the DOSPO would coordinate this, where the big one being the portfolio discipline, where it's more about ecosystem-wide coverage and opportunity cost. And so what did we learn with trying to build the proto DOSPO? Four things that pioneered all this is in a Web3 ecosystem, governance legitimacy is the foundation. It's not an afterthought. Nothing moves without a clear on-chain mandate, and authority assumed is authority contested. You can't just come in and claim to be the de facto. You need a community consensus. It is its own living government, and it's kind of like someone coming in telling the US what to do. No, we have a whole democracy model that needs to adopt them to give them that power. And operational neutrality is must be structurally guaranteed. So with a lot of foundation models, MBOs, etc., with Web3 concepts, that central actor capture risk can pervert the intended outcomes for these programs. So having someone that's completely focused on we are bound to the community and its overall governance process, we have to deliver on this, prevents that capture. And it also means because they're not just given a bunch of what we call Genesis allocation of a token launch to sit on and do nothing, them being dependent during their life cycle for renewal on treasury and the governance actions, make sure that they continue to be honest in their work. And then contributor pipelines are infrastructure, they're not events. Hackathons don't build your contributor bases, and one-off events are marketing, they're not operations. You need contribution ladders, you need mentors, and you need programs that help do that and bring in new talent. And the fourth one is measure ecosystem health, not just the commit activity. That's a big one for Web3 because when you're talking about spending taxpayer funds, you need to make sure the projects are having impact, and it's not just a project that was grant funded for an MVP and then died. So what can an OSPO community borrow from Web3? I think this ties into the first point that OSPOs can be decentralized in a way of like the ethos of working together. I know InnerSource kind of does this, but it was pioneered to be more teach closed source engineering firms to work with each other. But you can actually be decentralized in your focus and still all complement each other. That one can be interpreted based on your use case. And open participation beats closed pipelines. Let contributors from outside a specific team be able to contribute to a project. If an open source project, if you look at your metrics, and it's mostly your development team, is it really open source? And on-chain governance creates legitimacy. This is one I'm actually advocating for Web 2.2, is there's a team I'm working with where if you're familiar with Credly and or the GitHub commits, where all your, I guess you could call merit of contributions is tracked in those things. If a system goes down or the main actor supporting it goes down, you lose all that proof of merit unless you have a digital copy. There's a system called Andamio, which actually takes on activities that you can track on chain and gives you a backed credential on their portfolio, and it's decentralized, so you can take it and own it and do whatever you want. They actually don't own the base protocol. They just operate the general mechanism. So your data is what you own on that. And then health metrics matter more than the activity metrics. Basically, how you're affecting the periphery around you. Because what I'm trying to get is most open source contributions go downstream, but what about the upstream contributions and making sure your SBOM's taken care of? Where the whole basis of this actually came from Christian Grobmeier at the Apache Foundation and his experience with Log4j and the Log4 shell incident, and how we prevent situations like that from arising, especially with Web3 being able to take care of itself. So one thing that's coming out of this is we did get the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust to sponsor a lab. We're calling it the Frontiers Lab because it's helping pioneer this new next generation of open source ecosystems will run on the frameworks, etc. There wasn't a to-do group for Web3, so we're trying this lab out to see if we can build some reference architecture there. And if you do DM me at oscowboyc.com, I can get you plugged in. We just got approval last week, so we're still setting up the Discord as well as the GitHub for it. But the idea is we're going to build research sustainability and frontier ecosystems. Like I said, there's 20,000 some blockchains. Everyone's doing something different. We can actually take use cases and pilot in different ecosystems because finance and blockchain is not necessarily the issue. It's the intended outcomes. And that maybe this can be something portable to Web 2 where revenue tends to be the problem to sustaining open source. And then where develop reference models, frameworks, pilot programs, validate stuff, and publish white papers. And if I'll drop the publications to the 2 white papers on the DOSPO and the OMF, but those are 2 halves to a whole, trying to address a unique situation within Web3. But yeah, just let me know if y'all have questions. I know it's a lot to take in all.
That is fantastic. It is a lot. And but it's really well thought out, has a great structure. And I love one of the things I think is most important about open source is that I welcome all of these different ideas and people's different voices, and that's what I think makes it strongest. My one question for you, I'm just curious, how has it been taken in? Like, are people like interested in receiving it?
Yeah.
Like all of this new information?
Well, the whole proto-DOSPO, just so you see the authenticity to it, is I pioneered the idea of different sustainability programs, and we published a white paper, me and some contributors, gave it to the overall
Yes.
Cardano community, and then put it together through a proposal under Intersect. And it had to go through all 3 of those legislative bodies to actually get approved, and they approved a $6 million fund to pilot some of those programs to see the impact. So, and we've already got interest from other ecosystems that have tapped me trying to figure out what they can do that's similar. Because figuring out how to get bang for buck's the biggest problem in Web3 and sustaining
Sure.
people to do stuff. And I'm happy to see too that Christian Grobmeyer got spotlight, and a lot more programs in Web2 are all about open source sustainability and evangelism of his experience. Because me and him helped pioneer this, and now he's carrying forth that evangelism. So I do think there's a lot of merit
Excellent.
to it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's super interesting and I think really helpful to be aware of how people are thinking through things. So thank you.